regularly at XO meetings of individuals from the Number 10 team who were known to have the ear of the Prime Minister, and in addition, the secondment to the XO committee of some of the very best civil servants within the Cabinet Office. Within the civil service, people will know that even though someone may be not perhaps the most senior in the hierarchy, they're someone who commands respect for their ability to achieve change and to coordinate action. So the fact that we had civil servants like Jess Glover, Pamela Dow, and others working on the XO committee was a clear sign that some of the creme de la creme in the Cabinet Office were committed to this project.
And so far as the XS committee was concerned, was that routinely chaired by the Prime Minister?
Yes.
Now, as part of the documents which you have exhibited to your statement, we have been able to consider the report from the Cabinet Secretariat on XO Lessons Learned, a review that took place in December of 2019. I don't propose, Secretary of State, to take you through it in detail, but would it be a fair summary to say that given the perceived productivity and success of the XO-XS model, there was a desire to see if its governance structure might be applicable to non-Brexit issues, or whether successful elements of its governance structure could be applied to other more normal time committee structures?
I think that's fair, and I think it is also the case that the Institute for Government, which acts as a critical friend to successive administrations, also reflected that while not every aspect of Brexit preparedness was perfect, nevertheless, the committee structure and the operation of XO brought benefits.
Thank you. Were there doubts, though, as to how far it might be capable of application because of the need to maintain pace and focus and engagement?
Yes. One of the challenges that Whitehall and ministers faced is because there was a deadline. Of course, the deadline was extended. But because there was a deadline, we knew that with a ticking clock at our back, we needed to proceed at pace. That meant that the normal tempo of papers being produced within Whitehall was accelerated. And I think it is fair to say that outside crisis situations or big projects in which the Prime Minister has invested an enormous amount of interest, that the rhythm that XO maintained, the daily battle rhythm, would be difficult to sustain. But I do believe that it was helpful for all of government to be operating at that pace, because we made government more match fit overall for the terrible events that this inquiry has been set up to look at.
Yes, and I think the Institute of Government comment piece that you also appended to your witness statement suggests in similar terms that it is a model that is worth replicating in certain circumstances, but that the pace would not always be sustainable, as you've explained. You also tell us in your witness statement that, in your opinion, one of the central lessons of the pandemic in terms of preparedness is that whole system resilience issues should be planned for better, that the initial structures were simply not adequate for a civil contingency of that scale and nature, and that the pandemic required a truly cross-government whole system response with delivery structures on an integrated and coordinated basis. Now, there is a suggestion in the Institute of Government article that the XO-XS model was at least partly born out of your frustrations with the ability of the United Kingdom government to handle preparing for a whole system risk of this nature. So my question to you is this: given that the whole risk systems have been on the NSRA and NRA for many years, what does it say about the United Kingdom government that these kind of issues with cross-government working and the need for whole system structures for whole system risks was not recognised at an earlier stage?
I think there would be those who would argue that significant progress had been made following on from the establishment of the National Security Council and the updating of the National Security Risk Assessment and its public manifestation, the National Risk Register. But one can always learn and improve. I was struck when I was at the Department for Environment by two things which relate to your question. The first is that the Department for the Environment is the lead government department when it comes to floods and, of course, animal disease. I had observed that LRFs, local resilience fora, had not performed as they should at the time of the Grenfell fire. I was concerned that they would not be able to cope as they should in the event of severe flooding. And I asked a retired military planner, General Tim Cross, to look at the readiness of local resilience fora in the event of floods. The report that he prepared for my department, while it highlighted much good work, reinforced the fact that there were a series of weaknesses in the transmission mechanism from the local to the central and from the individual government department to the centre. In addition, when I was preparing within the Department for the Environment for the effects of a no-deal exit, and they would have been significant on food supplies and on other questions, I was struck by the fact that the centre did not seem to have the galvanic energy required in order to make sure that each government department was doing as it should. And this relates ultimately to a dysfunction in the design of the Cabinet Office, which we may turn to.
Right, thank you. Moving back, though, to the issue about which I was asking you, and setting out really the reason why I have focused on the XO-XS model. It's right, isn't it, that model was adapted for the COVID-O and COVID-S model, which in fact replaced COBRA. And when the inquiry comes to deal with Module 2, it will no doubt examine the efficiency of those committees. But that was the decision that was taken, I think, at that time, that the model that had been created and worked so well during the preparations for an EU exit was the basis for what happened during the outbreak of COVID in government. And so in that sense, it was a positive outcome of the EU exit preparations. But the inquiry has also heard evidence from witnesses within the UK government and also the devolved administrations about the adverse impact that the necessary planning for a no-deal EU exit had on other resilience activities and pandemic preparedness, and in particular heard from Catherine Hammond, who was the director of the CCS whilst you were the CDL. Do you accept that as a result of the necessity for workforce capacity to move over and deal with matters that were important in terms of the preparation for a no-deal EU exit, that had a detrimental effect on the preparation for pandemic planning?
No.
Why not?
Because I haven't yet seen any activity that has been identified that would have enabled us to significantly better deal with the COVID-19 pandemic that did not occur as a direct result of EU exit.
Well, are you aware of exercise Cygnus and the recommendations that came out of that, and the fact that the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board was created, was stood up in order to take forward the recommendations that came out of that exercise, but that board could not meet, and the work that it was expecting to do could not be carried out because of workforce capacity issues?
I have. My understanding is that the work of that team was shared with the then Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, David Lidington, in January of 2019. Various work streams were requested to be carried forward. That was agreed. And then the PFRP met again in November of 2019 to review progress. And I think in Catherine's evidence, she mentions that a significant proportion of that which was required, including stocking the appropriate antivirals to deal with the flu pandemic, carried on. But as the inquiry has had, ultimately the pandemic that occurred was not a flu pandemic. It was one for which we were unprepared because few Western nations, if any Western nations, had anticipated the particular type of pandemic that COVID-19 was.
The inquiry has also heard that certain aspects of the preparations within government for a pandemic influenza, and indeed the 2011 guidance, which was in the process of being updated, were capable of assisting in relation to the pandemic that hit, the pandemic of a coronavirus. And so wouldn't you accept that the stalling of the work on the updating of the guidance and the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board undoubtedly had an effect on the country's preparedness for the pandemic which hit?
I don't think that can be proven. In Catherine's own evidence, she alludes, I think, to 3 areas where she feels that CCS, as the central coordinating secretariat, could have done better in the specific area of the pandemic. She talks about emergency funding, she talks about the work of the Department for Education, and then she talks about CCS's own readiness to adapt its structures to a pandemic response. I actually think, and I have an enormous regard for Catherine, that on the first, emergency funding, the speed with which HMT initiated the furlough programme and the COVID business intervention loan scheme shows that the Treasury was agile, and I can't imagine that it could have been much more so. I do think she has a fair point when it comes to the whole question of school closure, and we may touch on that. But on the third point, CCS's own readiness, I also think that Catherine is being modest there in that CCS and the Cabinet Office overall did flex rapidly once it was clear what the scale of the pandemic was.
Well, we've looked at 2 documents dealing with staffing resources. There's a lessons learned report from the Cabinet Office regarding Operation Yellowhammer, which we see at 183, please. And could we go, please, first of all, to paragraph 5 of page 5 and look at 5B, which tells us that staff resourcing was and remains a concern for January 2020 for the majority of departments, DAs, IGs, and the Central Secretariat, including the CCS. And could we now go to page 14, please, and look at paragraph 28A, which deals with the balancing of business as usual in Yellowhammer work. Thank you. In fact, can we go to paragraph D, please, instead? Thank you. Balancing of business as usual and Yellowhammer work. In YH2, just pausing there were 2 periods of time dealing with Yellowhammer, weren't there? And this is the second such period. A number of people divided their time between ongoing BAU work and YH work in the months and weeks leading up to the IOC. IOC being... What does IOC mean in this context?
I'm not entirely sure.
All right, well, we'll find that out.
It was my point that acronyms don't always assist communication.
Oh, quite, my lady. This was deemed necessary prior to the arrival of the fast streamers, but it did result in significant overloading of staff and caused line managers problems in scheduling work to deadlines. It is obvious, is it not, that if an additional important work stream that is to be prioritised over business as usual work takes the workforce away from its business as usual, that is necessarily going to cause overloading of staff and problems in terms of focusing on the work which they were originally doing. Isn't that a logical conclusion of giving more work to the same number of people?
I'd say three things. The first thing is that the civil service grew and expanded in readiness for EU exit. And the number of people that we recruited overall, both in the Cabinet Office and in other departments, grew to take on this additional load. The second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the nature, the pace and the intensity of the work undoubtedly placed pressure on individuals and the system, but it also ensured a greater degree of match fitness for what none of us anticipated, but what was to come the year after. And the third thing is, as I say, it is difficult to identify what was anticipated, what could have been planned, and what was not carried forward that might have put us in a better position. Catherine identified three areas in her evidence. I mentioned the areas where I agree and disagree, but the fact that a committee did not meet does not mean that if it had, that that meeting in and of itself would have meant that we were significantly better prepared. And indeed, I would argue that the skills acquired, honed and refined during EU exit preparation helped us not only to have an organisational system that was better in dealing with the crisis, but having a cadre of people who have been through an intense process that enhanced their ability to respond.
In terms of workforce capacity, of course, it cannot be proved that the fact that a committee didn't meet means that we were not as well prepared for the pandemic as we might have been. But doesn't it stand to reason that a significant overloading of staff, as is set out in this paragraph here, is a reflection of the fact that there was too much work for the workforce in the civil service at the moment, whose focus was bent away from what they should have been doing, preparedness for a pandemic, towards EU exit?
No, I don't agree with that, because I think that the preparation for EU exit in and of itself was some of the best preparation that could have been undergone for any future crisis. One of the points that has, I think, been well made by Oliver Letwin and by others is that it is training, it is the acquisition of general skills in crisis management that is among the most useful ways of ensuring that we have pandemic preparedness. And of course, it is possible that had a particular meeting or had a particular work stream been taken forward, then we might have identified something that could have strengthened our ability to weather the pandemic. But nowhere have I seen, I think outside one or two scholarly articles from John Hopkins and elsewhere, anyone who was suggesting that government should be orienting its work towards the particular type of pandemic that COVID was to become.
All right. The inquiry has heard evidence that there is likely to be an increase in concurrent and cascading risks due to the ever more complex world in which we live. And you have set out in your witness statement why you do not think it appropriate for there to be a standing capacity ready to coordinate fully an emergency situation or a dedicated team of officials on hand to create the scale of intervention which lockdown or something akin to lockdown ultimately required. But what you suggest in the witness statement is that it's reasonable to expect the centre of government to have tried and tested plans in place by way of an alternative to a standing capacity. You've mentioned Sir Oliver Letwin. He gave evidence to my lady on the issue of the creation of a National Resilience Institute, which he suggested to my lady was certainly worth considering. What do you think about that suggestion? And would the creation of a Resilience Institute, bringing with it its new architecture, a chair, a board, the work which it could be doing full time, does that go any way to fitting the bill in terms of what we need going forwards for the additional challenges that lie ahead?
I think, as is so often the case with Oliver, that it is a very good idea. I think it is necessary but not sufficient.
Why not?
Because more, I think, requires to be done. So in some of the work reviewing the fitness and appropriateness of our structures, including Oliver's own evidence, I think there is much that is good. I think that the notion that there should be a lead minister at cabinet level with responsibility for resilience, I don't think it should be a minister just for resilience. I can expand on that if required. But I think that that is appropriate. I think that elevating the role of the Deputy National Security Advisor, who is responsible for dealing with threats and hazards and resilience, is important as well. I think that strengthening the role of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, the Resilience Directorate, is important. But there is one more thing, which is that my own view is that the relevant minister responsible for resilience should be the lead minister in the Cabinet Office, although they are called Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster or whatever.
Yes.
They would have other responsibilities. But one of the problems within the Cabinet Office is that whoever is the lead minister there does not have full oversight over the whole of the Cabinet Office in the way that a Secretary of State does over their department. The National Security Secretariat was an area that was to an extent shielded from my view during a lot of my time when I was nominally in charge of the Cabinet Office. And I think that this is an overhang from the way in which the Cabinet Office was originally set up to serve the Cabinet Secretary rather than to be a department with a lead minister wholly responsible for its operation.
And do you also agree with the evidence that the inquiry has heard, not only from Sir Oliver Letwin, but also from others, including Sir Chris Whitty, that ministers working within resilience need to have appropriate training?
Yes.
Right. There is a balance to be struck, is there not, between the challenge that ministers bring to the scientists who are advising government departments in not being scientifically qualified, and the importance of that challenge, as far as this inquiry has heard, is in order to alleviate the possibility of groupthink within the scientific advice that's being given. What level of training do you think ministers should have in order to get the balance right? I
think ministers definitely would benefit from training, and I think there are several aspects to it. The first is learning from those ministers who either have experience or ex-ministers who have experience in handling crises. I think also undertaking exercises. Again, I think Sir Oliver's recommendation of a much more regular tempo of exercise involving military planners so that it is close to the sorts of simulations that the armed forces undertake is absolutely right, and it's having something as close to an emergency as possible that will enable ministers to learn better. But your other point is absolutely spot on. Sir Oliver is right. Politicians, as he said, are amateurs. When we are engaging with professionals and experts, what we bring is not deep subject expertise, but what we bring is the capacity to ask the daft laddie question. And sometimes it is only when someone asks that question that we find out that the emperor has no clothes, or the pandemic preparedness plan has a huge hole in the middle.
There needs, doesn't there, to be a level of understanding, though, within ministers as to what questions to ask. The way in which Sir Chris Whitty explained that conundrum to the inquiry was to say that in every emergency he's ever seen, there is a desperate need to get scientists in the room. But between emergencies, you have to kind of elbow your way in, is how he explained it. So does there need to be a standing capacity for the provision of scientific advice, and a need perhaps through exercising or through other organised workshops for ministers to have and to keep having, in other words, so that doesn't get stale, a level of understanding as to what sort of pathogens, pandemic situations or other scientific matters of risk are coming down the line?
Yes, it would be a very rare person who had a level of knowledge which would mean that they would be omnicompetent in every emerging crisis. It would be rare to have someone who would simultaneously understand terrorist threats, cyber threats, pandemic threats, and the risks to critical national infrastructure. I think the only person I can think of who comes close to that is Oliver Letwin. And as I think David Cameron said, you can't clone Oliver. If only you had a government composed of Olivers, it would be a better world. But your basic point is absolutely right, that ministers, particularly if they have departmental responsibilities, do need to acquaint themselves with some of the scientific issues. And most recently, one science issue, a science risk and opportunity, the growth of artificial intelligence, has been discussed around the cabinet table with the government's chief scientific advisor, and ministers brought to that conversation a base level of knowledge enhanced by what Dame Angela was able to tell us.
And finally, on this point, you raise in your witness statement the need for consistent challenge, for what you describe as red teaming.
Yes.
That's something which should always be present in any of the groups, be it scientific or governmental or a combination of both, that meet in relation to pandemic planning going forwards, and also a nod to resilience.
Yes, I do think that. And I think there is a danger in groupthink. There is also a danger, and again Oliver Letwin brought this out, that people within a civil service hierarchy or within a political culture will not wish to seem awkward. They will not wish to be the person questioning their superior in front of another. So having people who are charged explicitly with being awkward and thinking of what may be wrong in a particular case is useful. And I have found that in some of the departments in which I have worked, having a team within the department to do that is useful. So within within DLUC at the moment, we have a policy unit that is there both to complement, but also to challenge the policy propositions that are put forward by others.
The inquiry has heard that there are very few risks which don't require the involvement of more than one government department, especially as I've already made mention of the fact as we go forwards in time, there are more concurrent and cascading risks that are likely to occur. Taking that into account, is the lead government department system flawed?
It has its flaws. There are obvious areas where the expertise and the personnel within the lead government department will be well equipped to deal with a particular situation. I mentioned flooding earlier. DEFRA, its relationship with LRFs and the Environment Agency and the expertise that it has, means it is the natural lead government department. Sometimes the nature and scale of a flood will mean that there needs to be a MACA request, a request to the military to help the civil power, and you will need an armed forces minister or the Secretary of State for Defence there. Sometimes there will be local government or health ramifications, but essentially DEFRA is the logical lead department there. But as COVID-19 showed, DHSC, even though it had, I think, a very good Secretary of State and an excellent ministerial and official team, simply could not coordinate the scale of activity across government required. Similarly, while it is obviously the Home Office that has the expertise in dealing with terrorism, if, God forbid, there were to be another terrorist incident on UK soil, then I do not believe that the Home Office on its own would necessarily be able to play the role that an enhanced team in the Cabinet Office could provide.
So is there one system which works for the situation that might be created by all risks, or does the lead government's department system have within it a suitable level of flex in order to be able to adapt to the situation?
I think in the resilience framework that the government has just published, there's an acknowledgement that the lead government department model broadly works, which I think is right, as I hope I've explained, yes, but that there needs to be a strengthening of the centre. And I hope that one of the things that the inquiry will be able to help this government and future governments with is a better understanding of how that strengthened centre might operate.
On a slightly different topic, but connected, I think, is the division of roles between various government departments in terms of preparedness and resilience. We know that the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities has within it the Resilience and Recovery Directorate, which was formerly known as the Resilience Emergencies Division, and the connection that has with local government, which we'll come on to speak about in a moment. But the inquiry also knows and understands that the CCS sits within the Cabinet Office. And indeed, connected is the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which has within it the civil society and youth system, which touches upon the voluntary sector. If all of these different groups and bodies are necessarily part of planning and resilience, should they all sit within the same government department?
Yes.
Right, and how would that be achieved?
By what is known as a machinery of government change. It is the case that from time to time, areas which are the responsibility of one government department move to another. So it might be the case that the handling of or policy on privacy and freedom of information might move from the Ministry of Justice to the Cabinet Office, depending. My view is that RED should move from DLUC to the Cabinet Office, and RED developed, as the inquiry has heard, following the abolition of government offices of the regions.
Yes.
With the personnel there moving to DLUC, not all physically in the same building, several of them dispersed across the country, but the liaison function between local government, local resilience fora, and the centre was subsumed within that directorate. My view is, while the people leading it are excellent and the people working in it are very good, that it is logical for that to go into the Cabinet Office. And again, I reflected, and I hope that this isn't outside the scope of Module 1, early in the onset of the pandemic, when I was briefed by CCS on what my responsibilities might be as the lead Cabinet Office Minister at the time, CCS placed a special emphasis on dealing with excess deaths, because that was an area that other government departments didn't deal with, but they did. But there was less emphasis in that conversation on the need for the type of coordination which I believe only a central department like the Cabinet Office can lead.
And are there plans within government to effect that change?
Discussions are ongoing.
All right. Moving on then to talk about local government and the connection, as you've set out, between the local resilience fora and the government associations going up to central government. You will know that the inquiry has heard from Catherine Francis, and she told my lady that in her experience there was or has been no detraction from the relationship between local government and central government with the abolition of the regional level. And as you've explained, to a certain extent, some of those tasks that were carried out by the regional level have moved up to the central level, although they're still being maintained. Given that there is such a plethora of types of local authority in terms of their size, complexity, I think it was described as a patchwork quilt of different types of organisation. Is there an argument for reinstating the regional level of governance or of the presence of a regional level of connection?
I'm not sure is the honest answer. Even though the resilience team within DLUC, and formerly, of course, within MHCLG, operates to the Secretary of State within that government department, many of the people who work in it are based regionally, and there are 5 regional hubs, and the people who work there as government liaison officers and resilience advisors are out in the field. So there is a regional structure, as it were, within the department. Should one recreate the government office of the region structure? I personally don't think so, because I think, though it is obviously arguable, that what we should be seeking to do is to empower local leaders rather than, obviously there needs to be liaison, but empower them rather than have someone watching over them as a big brother. But, as your question clearly implies, there is a variation in quality and resource and structural power within local government. And I observed in my time at DEFRA that there were some local resilience fora which were excellent and others not so much. And the whole question about how we improve and strengthen the hand of local leaders to respond is, I think, a vital one.
Catherine Francis described to my lady that one of the purposes of RED is to act as a critical friend to the local resilience fora and the local government association. The inquiry heard yesterday from Mark Lloyd, who is the chief executive of the local government association, who explained to the inquiry that in his view, which is gleaned from the members of his organisation who are local authorities, there is a problem with information cascading down from central government to the local level. And by way of an example, or examples, he told my lady that it took the launch of judicial review proceedings for the exercise Cygnus report to be published, despite the fact that 6 years earlier, when the exercise had taken place, local resilience fora had been involved in the exercise. And as concerning, one might think, the entire existence of Exercise Alice and its report was only discovered by the local government association during its preparations for this inquiry. Do those examples show that there perhaps is a difficulty in central government acting with secrecy and not as the critical friend that has been described?
Yes, is the short answer. I'll expand a little. I have found in government that DLUC, or its predecessor department, MHCLG, is a good friend of local government, but not every arm of government, and I think this is true across administrations, Conservative, Coalition and Labour, has been as open, trusting and collaborative with local government as it should be. I think that that is part of politics. But change has come. And in the resilience framework that Oliver Dowden has published, it is clear that we will share information more effectively, that we will use platforms like Resilience Direct in order to ensure that the whole resilience community, as it were, is involved in these conversations. I would add two other things briefly. The first is that the people who lead local resilience fora will tend to be uniformed officers, principally from the police or the fire and rescue service, and sometimes elected councillors and officials within local government will feel that even at a local level, there isn't always the sharing of information that there should be, never mind between local and national.
Yes.
A wider sharing of information is in everyone's interests. And then the second thing is, in terms of the role of critical friend, I think, again, as the inquiry has heard, improving the quality of training matters. We have an emergency planning college, which the Cabinet Office maintains just outside York. I think more, significantly more, could be done to improve the work that it does and to share best practice. And again, the government skills and curriculum unit within the Cabinet Office, which was established by one of the great officials I mentioned earlier, Pamela Dow, and is now being led by another brilliant official, Sapana Agrawal. That unit, I think, should be working with the college in order to create a stronger institute of the kind you mentioned earlier.
In addition to which, does there need to be reflection given to whether or not the practical manner in which information is provided to local authorities and local resilience fora? And I'm thinking in particular in terms of the national risk assessment information,
yes,
cascading down so that that can be taken into account in the local risk assessment. There needs to be an assurance, surely within central government, that that practically is working, and that everybody who needs to have access to the Resilience Hub is able to do so.
Absolutely, and I think that that is there in the resilience framework that has been published, that the NRA and RSA work must be shared with those who will potentially be at the front line of response.
What do you say about the evidence that my lady heard yesterday from Mr. Lloyd about the level of assurance in terms of pandemic preparedness and resilience of what is going on at a local level? Because we know that the central government doesn't have an assurance role in terms of the plans that are drafted locally. One option which Mr. Lloyd presented to the inquiry yesterday was that there needed to be a procedure developed during which local resilience fora could check each other's plans, some sort of in-line assurance given. But that also, he said, democratic leaders, locally, democratic leaders should be involved in providing a level of assurance. Would that work, in your view, or should consideration be given to some sort of central assurance during and involving the RED process?
Yes.
Or another body?
I think both. Again, when I was at DEFRA, I mentioned I commissioned General Tim Cross to look at the level of preparedness across local resilience fora for flooding. And that work was useful in both stress testing, how well prepared LRFs were, and making recommendations. And one of the recommendations that Tim made, and again is there in your question, is peer challenge and peer review helps, that the democratically elected leader who will be accountable, and he or she will often be the face and voice of a community at a time of crisis, should be involved. But also there will be a level of expertise, whether at an emergency planning college or equivalent, or within the Cabinet Office and RED, that can really test plans and preparedness to make sure that they, I was about to say conform, but at least match expectations.
So a combination of both?
Yes.
Mr. Gove, sorry to interrupt. You said a little while ago that in your experience, some local resilience fora were excellent, and I quote you, some not so much.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of weaknesses did you identify in the local resilience fora where they were not so much excellent?
The most conspicuous example was in the aftermath of the Grenfell fire. I rejoined government just a few days before the fire occurred. I used to live very close to where the fire occurred, and in the days afterwards, I spent some time just walking around the scene, and my department is now responsible, obviously, for the aftermath. And it struck me then that essentially, and no individual is to blame, that that individual London borough was simply not up to dealing with that tragedy. Secondly, when I was at DEFRA, I also had responsibility, or the department had responsibility, for some of the clean-up work after the Salisbury Novichok poisoning. The local government figures in Wiltshire, leader of the council and others, were excellent, but some of the other people involved in emergency work there, a little less so. And I sense that sometimes we needed to, as we did at Grenfell, step in order to help to shore up a structure that wasn't as robust as it needed to be. In an ideal world, every LRF would be as strong as the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Community engagement. The inquiry has heard from John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister from the Scottish Government, that resilience has to be everybody's business. A sentiment echoed by Gillian Russell, the former Director of Safer Communities in Scottish Government, and also Professor Alexander, who told my lady in his evidence that at one level, risks are essentially owned by all of us, rather than by governments alone, and that we are all responsible for our own safety. Is it imperative that in preparing for a pandemic and attempting to ensure that the community is as resilient as possible, that there is significant community engagement?
Yes, and even before, I think there are obviously elements of preparedness for certain threats and hazards that can't be shared with everyone, particularly with threats. It would be obviously foolish to share with states and non-state actors who might wish us harm how we would respond in the event of a cyber attack or so on. However, a broader conversation about the impact that certain threats and hazards can have and how we can build resilience within society, I think, is a good thing. And as we saw in our media and in families and workplaces, during and after the pandemic, there has been a lively and informed conversation about the merits and demerits of lockdown. I think that while government can't mandate, it can help to lead and facilitate conversations about how we as a country can be more resilient in the face of certain threats and dangers, whether those are as a result of climate change or as the result of some of the threats to which I've alluded. So I think having that conversation and also more broadly reflecting on how civil society can remain strong is part of a broader programme of resilience.
The inquiry has received witness statements from those in positions of authority representing the British Red Cross, the Campaign and Justice at Inclusion in London, and also Disability Rights UK, which is a leading pan-disability charity, whose evidence reflects many organisations in a similar situation, and that is that in terms of pandemic preparedness, they were not engaged with at all, at any level, by government. Does that need to change?
I think it is important with preparedness for all sorts of threats and hazards, including pandemics, that the widest possible conversation takes place. But sometimes it will be the case that government will disappoint a particular group. As the inquiry has heard from David Cameron, George Osborne, and others, politics involves competing priorities. It's not always possible to satisfy every organisation, however noble its aims and means. It's not always possible to provide them with the list of policy changes or resource allocation for which they press. But it is important to have as many people as possible involved in conversations about risk, so that we can hear from voices which, as your question implies, have sometimes been marginalised and overlooked, and who represent groups that were, of course, hit particularly hard by COVID-19.
It's important, isn't it, for those who, as you acknowledge, might be the most affected
Yes.
by a pandemic, for the government to understand the ways in which that might happen and therefore might be avoided. And it isn't difficult for the government to reach out to, particularly to those who represent a great deal of people who are vulnerable, both in terms of general levels of vulnerability and health inequalities.
Absolutely. But I think it is important when we have these conversations that while groups that advocate for those who are living with vulnerabilities should be heard and should be respected, that we also make sure that the conversation is not exclusively one in which pressure groups take the lead, but wider society has its voices heard. A brief point. We discovered during the pandemic, medical experts would have known beforehand, that one of the greatest vulnerabilities, one of the likeliest comorbidities, was for those people who were living with obesity. And I think that a broader conversation about public health and the diet that we have and the pressures that creates is one which no single group, I think, has a monopoly of wisdom on.
Are you able to assist the inquiry by telling my lady what plans are afoot in terms of a greater level of cooperation with and consultation with these sorts of groups?
In my view, government has to ensure, and this inquiry helps, that we are in conversation with those in local government who are elected leaders from a variety of parties and traditions, and that we are also in conversation with groups that represent the marginalised and those who are vulnerable. And in my own department, the levelling up component involves me and my ministers and officials spending as much time as possible hearing from those people who are economically more vulnerable and socioeconomically more disadvantaged. And when it comes in particular to one of my other areas of responsibility, housing, what has struck me, not just because of the pandemic, but because of other factors, is that many of those who suffered most in the pandemic were living in overcrowded housing conditions or poor housing conditions, and the quality of housing, particularly but not exclusively in the socially rented sector, has been an issue that has been underplayed, and we've made it our mission to ensure that the voices of tenants, particularly in the socially rented sector, are amplified when it comes to policy making.
Are you confident that the ties between those organisations representing, as they do, the most vulnerable and those with health inequalities are tight enough, or could more be done?
More can always be done. I do not wish to make it seem trite, but I think health inequalities are some of the most striking inequalities within our society. But our society has a number of levels or layers of inequality. Again, in my work on levelling up, it's striking that while there is an enormous amount to celebrate about our country, that regional inequality, geographical inequality is quite marked, and health inequalities are also geographically very striking. And the point has been well made that the difference in life expectancy between Kensington and Chelsea and Blackpool, or even Glasgow, is something that no country can contemplate with equanimity.
You tell us in your witness statement that as the pandemic took hold and you became involved in meetings specific to the government response, that it appeared that the assumption had been that behaviours such as lockdown would not be viable for more than a brief period.
Yes.
And you will know that the inquiry has heard from Matt Hancock, who talked about flawed assumptions being in place, which affected the way in which planning went forwards. This week, we heard from Dr. Kekela, who suggested to my lady that it was imperative going forwards for behavioural science and social science to form an important place in any planning of how we are going to be able to fight the next pandemic coming down the line. And the importance of appreciating the effect of how that pandemic is not only going to affect different people in different ways, but what society is likely to do by way of reaction to rules being imposed and matters of that nature. Do you agree that behavioural science and social science has an important place in planning?
Oh, completely. But one of the reasons why ministers were told that there was a risk in lockdown and that toleration of lockdown would be limited was because of the behavioural science consensus with which we were presented. That's not to say that the people who were presenting were anything other than entirely rigorous and thoughtful in the way in which they assessed the evidence and presented it to us. But it's simply the case that the behavioural science assumptions turned out to be less, accurate about the durability and the willingness of the public to accept restrictions and liberty. Of course, none of us would want to impose these restrictions, but it was an example, as it were, of a scientific consensus framed on the basis of what was known, then changing over time as new evidence and new facts force the existing theory to adapt. And when, it became a cliche during the pandemic, when people said we needed to follow the science, what some sometimes forgot is that science itself changes and evolves as models improve because new evidence arrives.
Does that suggest that the advice that was being provided to the government then on behavioural science and behavioural reactions to the imposition of rules and regulations, that was out of date?
Well, I think it was the best available evidence at the time. So again, all of us have to recognise that when it comes to behavioural science, it is different from, as it were, physics, chemistry, and mathematics, where there can be a greater degree of precision in the expectation of what is going to happen if you introduce one element into water, or if you apply a certain degree of force to mass, then certain things are likely to follow. Behavioural science, by its very nature, is based on observation, but it is also the case that human beings, in our infinite, unpredictability, will sometimes react to new crises in ways that people cannot predict accurately. So behavioural science, like economics, is informed by past evidence and is shaped by expertise, but it cannot predict with certainty in the way that the hard physical sciences can. So it became out of date as we saw how people changed. But I would not want to criticise the people who put forward that evidence because they were acting in good faith. That was the best available evidence. It was just that new facts meant that we saw that it wasn't as accurate a predictor as we might have hoped.
Is there a need, do you think, for there to be a greater challenge to behavioural science before the advice gets to ministers? In other words, if there was a wider pool of scientists from whom that advice was sought, that there might be challenge inside the system, which would bring about perhaps a more accurate depiction of what the reality is.
I think that is fair, but I think it is also politicians who are sometimes at fault. Because we ask our advisors for the facts. And as I've mentioned, sometimes it is what we're really asking for is a prediction. And expert advisors can offer their best advice. We seek certainty, but it's often elusive. And it would be better if politicians and decision makers were to say, tell me about the debate. What is the lead option within the academic community here? But what also are the alternatives? So most people think that a lockdown might be very difficult, but are there some who argue that the tolerance for it would be greater? Similarly, most people assume that this virus emerged in the wet market, but some suggest it might be a lab leak. Where is the evidence? We need to have a certain degree of tolerance for the fact that we can't have certainty.
My lady, I'm about to go on to a new topic. Is that a convenient moment to break?
Mr. Gove, we take a break for the benefit of the stenographer, but we'll make sure that you leave this afternoon. We'll finish your evidence today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back at 3:10.